There are moments in life when everything you thought you understood about survival gets tested in ways you never imagined. When the sky turns black in the middle of summer, when the ground trembles beneath hooves that haven't trusted a human hand in years, when a woman who spent months learning to communicate with silence suddenly has to make a choice that could cost her everything she's worked for. That's when you discover what you're really made of. This is the story of a widow, a horse that refused to be broken, and a storm that arrived at the exact wrong moment. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the exact right one. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been so close to achieving something important that the universe seemed to test whether you truly deserved it? Because that's exactly what happened to the woman in this story. She'd spent 127 days gaining the trust of a horse that everyone said was impossible. And on day 128, nature decided to see if that trust was real. If you've ever faced a moment where everything hung in the balance, hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you want more stories about resilience that'll stay with you long after the video ends. And comment below with your city. I love knowing where these stories are reaching people around the world. Now let me take you to Montana, to a ranch where the wind carries secrets and where one woman was about to face the test of her life. The ranch sat in a valley between two mountain ranges in northwestern Montana, where the land rolled in waves of golden grass and the sky stretched so wide it made you feel small in the best possible way. It was called the Bridger property, named for the family that had owned it for 3 generations before financial troubles forced a sale. Now it belonged to a woman named Opal, who'd bought it 6 months ago with the life insurance money from her husband's death. Opal was 47 years old, with hands that showed every year of hard work and eyes that held a particular kind of sadness, the kind that comes from loving deeply and losing completely. Her husband, a man named Roy, had been a horse trainer, not the kind you see in movies, breaking spirits with force and dominance, but the patient kind, the kind who understood that horses, like people, carried trauma in their bodies and needed time to learn that not all humans would hurt them. Roy had died 2 years ago in a car accident on a wet road outside of Billings. One moment he was driving home from a training session, and the next moment he was gone. The world had a way of doing that, ending things without warning, without fairness, without giving you time to say what needed to be said. For 18 months after Roy's death, Opal had lived in a small apartment in town, working as a bookkeeper at a feed supply store, moving through her days like a ghost. She wasn't living, she was just not dying. Every morning she'd wake up and forget for 3 seconds that Roy was gone, and then she'd remember and the grief would slam into her chest like a physical thing. But Roy had left her something beyond memories. He'd left her notebooks, dozens of them, filled with his observations about horses, his training methods, his philosophy about trust and communication. And in one of those notebooks, on a page dated just 2 weeks before he died, he'd written something that Opal came back to again and again. The horse that nobody else can reach is the one that'll teach you the most about yourself. Don't ever be afraid of the hard ones, Opal. They're just waiting for someone patient enough to listen. So when the Bridger property went up for sale, 40 acres with a barn, a small house, and more solitude than most people could handle, Opal sold everything she owned and bought it. Not because she was running away from her old life, but because she was finally ready to run toward something, toward the woman she might become if she could learn to do what Roy had done, if she could learn to listen. The horse came 3 weeks after she moved in. His name was Flint, and he'd been rescued from a neglect situation in Wyoming. He was a 12-year-old Mustang gelding, dark bay, with a white star on his forehead and scars along his flanks that told stories Opal didn't want to imagine. The rescue organization warned her Flint hadn't let anyone touch him in the 2 years since his seizure. He'd kick, he'd bite, he'd throw himself against fences rather than let a human hand settle on his neck. 3 experienced trainers had tried and failed. The rescue was running out of options, and Opal was, in their words, his last chance before difficult decisions needed to be made. Opal understood what that meant. She'd agreed to take him, not because she was confident she could help him, but because Roy's voice in her head wouldn't let her say no to a creature that was running out of chances. For 127 days, she'd worked with Flint, not forcing, not demanding, just existing in his space. She'd sit in the round pen with a book, letting him learn that her presence didn't mean pain. She'd leave treats near the fence where he could take them without getting close to her. She'd talk to him in a low, steady voice about nothing important, the weather, the birds, what she was making for dinner, until her voice became part of the landscape, something familiar instead of frightening. And slowly, impossibly slowly, Flint had begun to trust. 2 weeks ago, he'd let her touch his shoulder. Last week, he'd eaten an apple from her hand. Yesterday, for the first time, he'd allowed her to slip a rope halter over his nose and behind his ears, standing still with only the slightest tremor running through his body. It was working. After more than 4 months of patient, careful work, it was finally working. And that's when the storm came. The morning of day 128 started like every other. Opal woke at 5:30, made coffee in the kitchen that still felt too quiet, and walked out to the barn as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The air had that particular stillness that comes before heat. When the world holds its breath between cool night and burning day, Flint was standing in the far corner of his paddock, watching her approach with ears pricked forward. That was new, the forward ears. For months, they'd been pinned back whenever she came near, a clear signal of distress and defensive aggression. But now, more often than not, he looked curious instead of afraid. It was a small thing, the angle of a horse's ears, but to Opal, it represented everything. It represented possibility. "Morning, friend," she said quietly, resting her forearms on the top rail of the fence. "Thought we might try something new today if you're willing." Flint snorted, shaking his head so his dark mane rippled. He took 2 steps toward her, then stopped, the eternal dance of approach and retreat that had defined their relationship. Opal stayed still, letting him decide. That was the foundation of everything Roy had taught her. Let the horse make the choice. Give them agency over their own bodies. Show them that yes and no were both acceptable answers. After a moment, Flint took 3 more steps, close enough now that Opal could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to touch if she'd been foolish enough to reach. But she wasn't. Not yet. She opened the gate slowly, moving like she was underwater, and stepped into the paddock. She'd been doing this for weeks now, sharing space with him, but always with a careful awareness of his body language, always ready to give him room if he needed it. Today he stood his ground as she walked in a wide arc around the perimeter, not looking directly at him, just existing in the same space. The round pen was adjacent to his paddock, a 60-foot circle of sand and safety where she'd spent countless hours teaching Flint that her presence meant consistency, not danger. Today she wanted to try something she'd been building toward for weeks, working with him at liberty in the pen. No ropes, no halter, just communication through body language and trust. It took 20 minutes of patient waiting, but eventually Flint followed her into the round pen of his own accord. That alone felt like a miracle. Opal closed the gate behind him and walked to the center, turning to face him with her shoulders soft, her posture non-threatening. "Let's see if you remember what we've been practicing," she said. She took a step toward his hindquarters, applying the gentlest pressure, and Flint moved forward, walking along the rail. It was the basic foundation of round pen work, asking the horse to move using body language, teaching them to read human cues, building a conversation without words. Roy used to say that this was where real training began, in the silent language of position and intention. Flint walked a full circle, and Opal felt something expand in her chest. She asked him to trot by, raising her energy slightly, and he did, his hooves creating a rhythm in the sand that sounded like hope. They worked like this for 15 minutes. Walk, trot, change direction, halt, and every single time, Flint responded. He was listening. He was trusting. Opal turned her body sideways, dropping her eyes and softening everything about her posture. the universal signal for "come here" in horse language. And after a moment of hesitation, Flint turned inward and walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away, breathing hard, his dark coat gleaming with sweat. "Good boy," Opal whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Such a good boy. She didn't reach for him. Not yet. That was the next step, the one they'd worked toward slowly. But this, having him choose to approach her, choose to stand in her space without fear, this was everything. She let him stand there for a long moment, then asked him to walk on again. They worked for another 30 minutes, and with each passing exercise, Opal felt more certain. They were ready. Tomorrow, maybe the day after, she'd try touching him while he was loose in the pen. She'd see if the trust they'd built was strong enough for that kind of vulnerability. She was so focused on Flint, so absorbed in the miracle of his cooperation, that she didn't notice the change in the air. Didn't notice how the morning light had taken on a strange, brassy quality. Didn't notice how the birds had stopped singing, leaving behind a silence that was too complete, too watchful. It wasn't until she led Flint back to his paddock and turned to head into the barn that she saw it. The sky to the west had turned the color of a bruise, dark purple-gray clouds, stacking up like a wall, advancing across the valley with unnatural speed. Opal's stomach dropped. She'd lived in Montana long enough to know what those clouds meant. A summer supercell, the kind that brought violent winds, hail and lightning that could split trees like kindling. The kind of storm that sent every living creature scrambling for shelter. She pulled out her phone and checked the weather radar. What she saw made her breath catch. A severe thunderstorm warning issued just minutes ago. Wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour expected. Possibility of tornadoes. The storm cell was moving northeast at 40 miles per hour, which meant she had maybe 30 minutes before it hit. 30 minutes to secure 40 acres of ranch property. 30 minutes to get 6 horses into the barn, along with the chickens, the barn cats, and anything that could become a projectile in high winds. And Flint, skittish, traumatized Flint, who had finally started to trust her, would have to be brought in from his paddock for the first time since he'd arrived. She'd been planning to wait another week before attempting that, to let their trust solidify further. But the storm wasn't going to wait. Opal looked at the darkening sky, then back at Flint, who was already pacing along his fence line, ears swiveling, nostrils flared. He could feel it too, the electricity in the air, the pressure change that told every animal with working instincts that danger was coming. "All right," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "All right. We're going to have to do this the hard way." Opal moved fast, her mind cataloging everything that needed to be done. First priority, the other horses. She had 5 besides Flint, 3 rescue cases in various stages of rehabilitation, and 2 older horses she'd bought at auction to save them from slaughter. They were all accustomed to coming into the barn during storms, which meant she could get them secured quickly. She jogged to the main pasture, where the 5 were already clustered near the gate, anxiety radiating from their tense bodies. Horses knew when weather was about to turn dangerous. They'd evolved to sense predators and environmental threats, and that ancient programming was firing on all cylinders now. "Come on, everyone," Opal called, opening the gate. The horses needed no encouragement. They filed past her at a trot, heading straight for the barn's wide double doors. She followed them in, quickly sorting them into stalls, checking water buckets and latching doors. The wind had already picked up, rattling the barn's metal roof with a sound like distant thunder. Next were the chickens. Opal sprinted to their coop and started herding the flock inside, a task made harder by the fact that chickens have the survival instincts of overconfident tourists. They scattered in every direction, clucking indignantly, until finally, the last hen was secured behind the reinforced door of their shelter. The barn cats, being cats, had already vanished into the hayloft, finding their own hiding spots in the way that cats do. Opal grabbed anything loose from the yard, a wheelbarrow, some tools, a length of rope that could become a whip in high winds, and threw everything into the barn. She checked her phone. 20 minutes had passed. The storm wall was visible now, a churning mass of clouds that looked less like weather and more like the end of the world. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the wind was gusting hard enough to grab her jacket and try to rip it off her shoulders, which left Flint. Opal grabbed a lid rope and a bucket of grain, then walked quickly to his paddock. Her heart was hammering, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to calm the adrenaline that wanted to make her movements sharp and sudden. Horses read human energy like a language, and if she brought fear and urgency into this interaction, Flint would mirror it tenfold. He was running now along the fence line, his tail flagged high, his nostrils wide. Every instinct in his wild Mustang blood was telling him to run, to put distance between himself and whatever danger was approaching. The paddock, which had felt like a safe space for months, now felt like a trap. "Flint!" Opal called, keeping her voice low and steady, even though the wind was starting to roar. "Flint, I need you to trust me now." She opened the gate and stepped inside. Flint wheeled away from her, galloping to the far corner, his hooves pounding the ground. Thunder rumbled in the distance, deep and ominous. This was the test. All those days of patient work, all those hours of sitting and waiting and building trust, it all came down to this moment. Could she ask Flint to do something that terrified him? Could he trust her enough to override his instincts? Opal didn't chase him. Chasing would confirm every fear he'd ever learned. Instead, she stood in the center of the paddock and waited, the lead rope in one hand, the grain bucket in the other. The wind whipped her hair across her face. The sky had taken on that greenish tinge that made experienced storm watchers start calculating distances to basements. "I know you're scared," she said, projecting her voice over the wind. "I'm scared too, but that barn is safe, Flint. I promise you, it's safe. You've got to let me help you." Flint was trembling, his entire body taut as a bowstring. He'd pressed himself into the corner, as far from Opal as the paddock allowed. His eyes were showing white all around, and his breath came in sharp, terrified snorts. Opal took one step toward him. He flinched, but held his ground. Another step. He tossed his head, clearly considering whether to try to bolt past her. The wind was howling now, bending the fence posts, and the first drops of rain had started to fall, big, heavy drops that hit like pellets. "Please," Opal said, and she wasn't even sure if she was talking to Flint or to Roy or to the universe itself. "Please, let this work." She took another step, close enough now that she could see every muscle quivering beneath Flint's dark coat, close enough to reach out if she dared. The rain was falling harder, soaking through her jacket. Lightning flashed, bright enough to leave after images, and the thunder that followed was immediate and deafening. Flint reared, pawing at the air, a wild scream tearing from his throat. When his front hooves hit the ground, he was looking straight at Opal, every line of his body asking the same question. "Are you the danger, or are you the shelter?" Opal didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, rain streaming down her face, letting him see that she wasn't attacking, wasn't forcing, wasn't anything except a human being who wanted to help. Roy used to say that the most important thing you could teach a horse was that you were safe to be with, especially when the world was scary, that you were the calm in the storm. And then, impossibly, Flint took a step toward her, then another. His legs were shaking so hard she could see it from 5 feet away. His breathing was ragged, but he was moving toward her instead of away from her, choosing trust over instinct, choosing to believe that this human might actually mean what she'd been telling him for 127 days. Opal's throat tightened. "That's it," she whispered. "That's my good boy. Just a little closer." Flint took another step. The wind tore at his mane, and the rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the paddock into a mud pit. Another flash of lightning, this one close enough that Opal felt the hair on her arms stand up, and the thunder was simultaneous, a crack like the sky splitting open. Flint didn't bolt. He stood there 3 feet from Opal, trembling violently, but standing. And in that moment, Opal understood what was happening. He was more afraid of the storm than he was of her, But beyond that, deeper than that, he was choosing to trust that she would take care of him. That her presence meant safety, even when everything else in the world was screaming danger. "Okay," Opal said softly, raising the lead rope very, very slowly. "Okay, sweetheart. I'm going to put this on you now, and then we're going to walk to the barn together. Can you do that for me?" The lead rope felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in Opal's hand. This was the moment she'd been working toward for more than 4 months, but she'd imagined it happening on a calm, sunny afternoon, with time to take it slow, to let Flint process each step. Not in the middle of a storm that was turning the world into chaos around them. The rope had a simple clasp on one end, designed to attach to a halter. But Flint wasn't wearing his halter. They'd been working up to that, planning to spend this week getting him comfortable with having it on for extended periods. Now Opal would have to slip it over his head, which meant reaching toward his face, toward the vulnerable places that traumatized horses protected most fiercely. "I need you to keep trusting me," Opal said, her voice barely audible over the wind. The rain was falling so hard it was difficult to see more than 10 feet in any direction. "Just for another minute, keep trusting me." She moved the lead rope slowly, telegraphing every motion, and reached toward Flint's neck. He flinched, his body coiling, ready to explode into flight. But he didn't run. Opal let her hand hover there, not touching, just existing in his space, giving him time to understand that this wasn't an attack. Then, moving so slowly it almost hurt, she draped the lead rope around his neck. The pressure made him dance sideways, his hooves slipping in the mud. But the rope gave him something physical to feel, something that grounded him in the moment. Opal kept one hand on the rope and used the other to pull a simple rope halter from her jacket pocket. The same one Flint had worn twice before, the one that carried her scent and the memory of calm moments. "Good boy," she murmured, running her hand along his neck now, feeling the rapid hammer of his pulse beneath his skin. "Such a brave boy." The wind was screaming now, a high-pitched wail that drowned out almost everything else. Something crashed in the distance, a tree branch maybe, or part of a fence blown loose. Flint's head shot up, his eyes rolling, and for a second Opal thought she'd lost him. But then his gaze found her face, and something in his expression shifted. He snorted hard, showering her with moisture from his nostrils, and then, miracle of miracles, he lowered his head. Opal didn't hesitate. She slipped the halter over his nose, behind his ears, and fastened it with shaking fingers. The moment the halter was secure, she clipped the lead rope to it and exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Okay," she said, water streaming down her face. "Okay, now we walk." She turned toward the barn, which was barely visible through the rain, a dark shape maybe 60 yards away. She applied gentle pressure to the lead rope, asking Flint to move with her. For one terrible moment he braced against it, his hooves digging into the mud, every instinct telling him not to let the pressure guide him. But then Opal's voice cut through his panic. "Walk with me, Flint. Come on, walk with me." And he did. One step, then another, his entire body rigid with fear but moving. They walked across the paddock to the gate, and Opal had to fumble with the latch one-handed while keeping tension on the lead rope. The gate swung open, caught by the wind, and slammed against the fence with a sound like a gunshot. Flint spooked, rearing up on his hind legs, and the lead rope burned through Opal's palm as he pulled against it. She didn't let go, couldn't let go. If he got loose now, in this storm, running blind with panic, he could hurt himself or disappear into the mountains where she'd never find him. "Flint!" she shouted, her voice raw. "Flint, stay with me!" He came down hard, all 4 hooves hitting the ground, and stood there shaking, his eyes locked on hers. And in that moment, Opal saw something she'd never seen before in his expression. A question, a genuine, conscious question. "Do I follow you, or do I run?" "Follow me," Opal said softer now. "Please, Flint, follow me." The distance between the paddock and the barn had never seemed so vast. 60 yards of open ground, with the wind trying to push them sideways, and the rain so thick it was like walking through a waterfall. Lightning struck somewhere close, the flash and thunder simultaneous, and Flint spooked again. But this time, he didn't rear. He just pressed close to Opal's side, so close she could feel the heat of his body, and together they stumbled forward through the storm. 40 yards. 30. Opal's boots were caked with mud, and she'd lost feeling in her hand where the lead rope had cut into her palm. But Flint was still with her, still moving, his head level with her shoulder now, almost like he was using her as a guide through the chaos. 20 yards. The barn doors were ahead, the opening a dark mouth that promised shelter. But as they got closer, something inside the barn crashed. One of the other horses, probably, spooked by the storm, and Flint stopped dead, bracing all four legs, pulling back against the lead rope with strength Opal couldn't match. "No, no, no," she gasped, digging her heels into the mud. "Don't do this now, we're so close." But Flint's eyes were fixed on the barn, and every instinct that told him enclosed spaces were traps was firing at full volume. He'd been trapped before, in dark places where humans hurt him. The barn was dark, the barn was enclosed, the barn was danger. Opal's mind raced. She couldn't pull him in by force. He was 1,000 pounds of muscle and fear, and she was a 130-pound woman at the end of her strength. If she tried to drag him, she'd lose him. But if she didn't get him inside in the next few minutes, the storm would make the decision for both of them. She looked at the barn, then back at Flint's terrified eyes, and then she made a choice that went against every practical instinct she had. She dropped the lead rope. Flint froze, surprised. The rope dangled from his halter, trailing on the ground, and suddenly he wasn't being forced anywhere. He had a choice. Opal took 2 steps toward the barn, then turned back to face him. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Rain was pouring down so hard she had to squint to see him through the grey curtain. "Flint," she called, "I'm not going to make you, but I'm going in that barn because it's safe in there, and I'm hoping you'll choose to come with me." She turned and walked toward the barn doors. Behind her she heard Flint whicker, a sound of distress and confusion. Every step felt like walking away from 127 days of work, like abandoning him. But forcing him would break everything they'd built. The only way forward was to let him choose. 10 feet from the barn, 5 feet. Opal reached the doorway and turned around, her heart in her throat. Flint was still standing where she'd left him, the lead rope on the ground, rain streaming off his coat. The storm raged around him, and then, very slowly, he took a step toward her, then another. Then suddenly, he was trotting, his hooves throwing up sprays of mud, heading straight for the barn, with Opal silhouetted in the doorway. Flint burst through the barn doors like he was being chased by demons, and Opal barely got out of his way in time. He slid to a stop in the main aisle, his sides heaving, water dripping from every part of his body, and stood there looking around with wild eyes at the other horses in their stalls, at the cats peering down from the hayloft, at everything that made the barn a place of strange shadows and unfamiliar sounds. Opal quickly slid the barn doors closed, shutting out the worst of the storm. The noise immediately dropped from a roar to a rumble, and the sudden relative quiet was almost disorienting. She stood there for a moment, her back against the doors, water pooling around her boots, and just breathed. Flint was inside. After everything, he was inside. But the storm wasn't over, and neither was the work. Opal grabbed a towel from the tack room and quickly dried her face and hands, then picked up the lead rope that was still attached to Flint's halter. He'd moved to the far end of the barn aisle and was pacing, clearly agitated by the confined space, his nostrils flaring as he tried to process all the new information flooding his senses. The barn had 6 stalls, and 5 were occupied. The 6th, the largest corner stall with windows that looked out over the valley, had been sitting empty since Opal bought the property. She'd been preparing it for Flint, slowly, adding deep bedding and water buckets and hay nets, making it ready for the day when he might be ready to come inside. That day, apparently, was today. "All right, friend," Opal said softly, approaching Flint with slow, deliberate movements. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Getting him into the stall was its own challenge. The opening looked like a trap to Flint, a narrow space he'd have to squeeze through, with walls on both sides that could pin him. Opal didn't force it. She simply walked to the stall, opened the door wide, and stood at the threshold. Outside, the storm intensified. Hail started hammering the barn roof, a deafening percussion that made all 6 horses, including Flint, throw their heads and dance in place. The barn lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Opal sent a silent prayer of gratitude for the backup generator she'd installed last month. "I know this is scary," Opal said to Flint, who was now pressed against the barn's far wall, as far from the stall as he could get. "But that stall has thick walls. It's the safest place in this barn. I wouldn't put you anywhere that wasn't safe." She waited. The hail continued its assault on the roof, and thunder rolled across the valley in continuous, overlapping waves. Flint stood frozen, his body language screaming conflict. Stay with the human who'd proven trustworthy, or run from the enclosed space that looked like a prison. Then Opal did something she'd seen Roy do once, years ago, with a terrified rescue horse. She walked into the stall herself, sat down in the corner on the clean straw bedding, and just existed there. Made herself small, made herself non-threatening, showed Flint that the space was safe enough for her to be vulnerable in it. Minutes passed. The storm raged, and slowly, so slowly, Flint's curiosity overcame his fear. He took one tentative step toward the stall opening, then another. His neck was stretched out, his nostrils working, trying to understand why the human had made herself so small and calm in that space. He put his head through the doorway, then pulled back. Did it again. Each time, he withdrew less quickly. And finally, with a snort that sounded almost like resignation, Flint walked into the stall. Opal didn't move from her corner. She let Flint explore the space, sniffing the walls, investigating the water bucket, pawing at the straw. He circled the stall 3 times, and each time he passed Opal, his head dropped a little lower, his tension easing by small degrees. After the 3rd circle, Flint stopped directly in front of where Opal sat. He lowered his head until his nose was level with her face, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. His breath was warm on her cheeks. His eyes, this close, were impossibly deep. "You did it," Opal whispered. "You trusted me, and you did it." Very slowly, she raised one hand and placed it on Flint's neck. He flinched, but didn't pull away. She kept her hand there, feeling his pulse gradually slow, feeling the tremors that ran through his muscles begin to subside. Outside, the storm was still raging, but in here in this stall there was something that felt almost like peace. Opal stood up carefully, keeping her movement slow. She unclipped the lead rope from Flint's halter and backed toward the stall door. Flint watched her go, but didn't follow. She stepped out into the aisle and closed the door behind her, latching it securely. Through the stall bars, she watched Flint walk to the hay net and pull out a mouthful of Timothy hay. He chewed mechanically, his eyes half closed, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. The other horses had settled too, the storm's fury becoming background noise as the barn's solid walls held firm against the wind. Opal walked to the barn's small office, where she kept a first aid kit and emergency supplies. Her hand was bleeding where the lead rope had cut into her palm, and her whole body was starting to shake now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She cleaned and bandaged her hand, then made herself a cup of instant coffee with water heated on the small electric kettle she kept for nights when she needed to watch over a sick animal. The coffee was terrible, but it was hot, and Opal wrapped both hands around the mug and let the warmth seep into her fingers. Through the office window she could see Flint's stall, could see his dark shape moving occasionally as he adjusted position or grabbed another mouthful of hay. They'd done it. Against all odds, in the middle of a storm that was still trying to tear the world apart, they'd done it. But Opal knew, in the way that people who work with traumatized creatures always know, that this was just the beginning. Getting Flint into the barn was one thing. Helping him understand that it was safe to stay, safe to relax, safe to trust that he wouldn't be hurt here, That would take more time, more patience, more of the careful, consistent work that had defined the last 127 days. The storm outside reached its peak around midnight. Opal had moved a camping chair into the barn aisle and was sitting where she could see all the stalls, including Flint's. The wind was so strong, it found every gap in the barn's walls and howled through them like something alive and angry. The horses were restless, moving in their stalls, calling to each other with worried whinnies. And then, without warning, Flint called back. It was the first time Opal had heard him vocalize to the other horses, a deep, rumbling whinny that seemed to say, "I'm here, I'm with you." And the barn's energy shifted. The other horses settled. The cats stopped pacing in the loft. Even the chickens in their coop stopped their distressed clucking. Flint had become part of the herd. Opal felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother wiping them away. Roy would have loved this moment, would have understood exactly what it meant. Not just that Flint had found physical shelter, but that he'd taken the first step toward belonging somewhere, toward being part of a community again instead of a solitary creature defined by his trauma. The storm raged on, but inside the barn, 7 horses and 1 woman weathered it together, and that made all the difference. At 2:17 in the morning, the tornado sirens started wailing. Opal had been dozing in her chair, exhausted from the hours of tension, but the sound jolted her awake instantly. Her phone was already buzzing with an emergency alert. Tornado on the ground 3 miles southwest of her location, moving northeast, which meant moving directly toward the ranch. 3 miles. At the speed tornadoes traveled, that gave her maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. The barn, solid as it was, wouldn't survive a direct hit from a tornado. Nothing would except the root cellar that was dug into the hillside behind the house, a relic from the original homestead, reinforced with concrete and a steel door. It was built to survive the worst that Montana weather could throw at it. But it was built for humans, not horses. Opal's mind raced through impossible calculations. She couldn't get 7 horses into a root cellar. The best she could do was open the barn doors and hope they'd run clear of the tornado's path, hope their instincts would lead them to safety. It went against everything she believed in, turning animals loose in the middle of a storm. But a barn hit by a tornado became a death trap of flying debris and collapsing walls. She ran down the barn aisle, throwing open stall doors. "Go!" she shouted at the confused horses. "Get out!" Most of them needed no encouragement. The moment their doors opened, they bolted for the barn's main entrance, where Opal had already hauled the big doors wide open. They disappeared into the storm, their hoofbeats swallowed by the wind. But when Opal reached Flint's stall, he was backed into the far corner, every line of his body radiating terror. The door was open. Freedom was right there. But Flint wasn't moving. After everything, after finally finding shelter, after finally trusting enough to come inside, his traumatized mind had fixated on one fact. This stall was safe. Outside was danger, and nothing Opal could do was convincing him otherwise. "Flint, please," Opal begged, entering the stall. The tornado sirens were still wailing, a sound designed to trigger every survival instinct. "Please, you have to run. The barn isn't safe right now." Flint pressed harder into the corner, his eyes showing white all around. He was shutting down, retreating into himself the way traumatized animals do when the world becomes too overwhelming. Opal had seen it before, the 1,000-yard stare, the complete stillness that looked like calm, but was actually a nervous system in total collapse. She had maybe 5 minutes now. She could feel the pressure in the air, could hear the freight train roar of the tornado getting closer. The barn's metal roof was groaning, and dust was raining down from the rafters. Opal made a decision. If Flint wouldn't leave, then neither would she. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and typed a quick message to her neighbor 12 miles away. "Tornado coming. I'm in the barn. Tell my sister I love her." Then she put the phone in her pocket, walked over to Flint, and sat down in the straw beside him. "Okay," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Okay, we're staying. You and me." Flint's head dropped, and he pressed his muzzle against her shoulder. the first time he'd ever initiated contact with her. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that Opal's chest constricted with a feeling too big for words. "I've got you," she whispered, wrapping one arm around his neck. "Whatever happens, I've got you." The roar was deafening now. The barn lights went out, plunging them into darkness. Opal could feel the building shaking, could hear things tearing and breaking. She pressed her face against Flint's neck and felt him trembling against her. And in that moment, she understood something profound. Trust wasn't just about the good times. It wasn't just about patience and treats and gentle words on sunny afternoons. Real trust, the kind that changed you, was about who you stayed with when everything was falling apart. The noise reached a crescendo, a roar so loud it felt like the world was ending. Opal felt the barn shudder, felt the walls flex, and she held Flint tighter, held him like she could shield him with her body from the storm's fury. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the roar began to fade. The tornado was moving past them, veering slightly east, its path taking it across the valley instead of directly over the ranch. The barn was still standing. They were still alive. Opal didn't move for a long moment. She stayed there on the ground, her arm around Flint's neck, feeling his heart hammering against her shoulder. Gradually, the pressure in her ears equalized. The roaring faded to the steady sound of rain. The tornado sirens went silent. "We made it," Opal said, her voice breaking. "Flint, we made it." She felt Flint's body relax against her, felt the terror slowly draining out of him. And then he did something that Opal would remember for the rest of her life. He lowered himself to the ground, folding his legs beneath him, and lay down next to her in the straw. Horses don't lie down. Around humans, they don't trust completely. When a horse lies down, they're making themselves vulnerable, giving up their ability to flee. It's an act of absolute faith. And Flint, after everything, was choosing to be vulnerable with her. Opal lay down too, curling on her side in the straw, and Flint rested his head across her lap. They stayed like that, as the storm finally began to break up, as the thunder grew more distant, and the rain softened to a steady patter on what remained of the barn's roof. When the emergency alert on Opal's phone finally signaled the all-clear, tornado warning lifted, danger past, she was crying for Roy, who had taught her how to do this. Crying for Flint, who had survived so much and was finally learning that he could stop surviving and start living. Crying for herself, for the woman she'd been 18 months ago, who didn't think she'd ever feel whole again. The barn had sustained damage. Part of the roof was torn away, and one wall had buckled, but the structure had held. As dawn light began to filter through the gaps in the damaged roof, Opal could see that the tornado had carved a path through the valley about a quarter-mile to the east. Trees were down, and she could see debris scattered across the landscape. But the barn was standing, the house was standing. They'd been incredibly lucky. One by one, the other horses began returning. They appeared out of the grey morning light, muddy and bedraggled but unharmed, and walked back into the barn like they were coming home. Opal stood at the barn entrance and counted them as they came in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all present and accounted for. She looked back at Flint's stall. He was still lying in the straw, watching her with calm eyes. And Opal understood that something fundamental had changed. The horse who couldn't trust humans, who had spent 2 years keeping everyone at arm's length, had finally let someone in. Not because she'd forced him or broken him, but because she'd stayed. Because when the world was ending, she'd chosen to sit with him in the darkness. "Come on," Opal said softly to the other horses. "Let's get you all settled." The week after the storm was chaos. Insurance adjusters came to assess the damage to the barn and the property. Contractors gave estimates for repairs. Neighbors stopped by with food and offers of help, the way rural communities do when one of their own has survived something terrible. But through it all, Opal kept working with Flint. The storm had changed something in him. The horse, who had spent months refusing to fully surrender to trust, now sought out Opal's presence. When she came to the barn in the mornings, he'd call to her with a low whinny. When she moved through the barn doing chores, his eyes followed her everywhere, and when she entered his stall, he'd walk over to her immediately, pressing his nose against her hand in a gesture that looked remarkably like affection. 3 days after the storm, Opal was able to touch him freely, his neck, his shoulders, his face, even his legs. A week after the storm, she brushed him for the first time, and Flint stood perfectly still, his eyes half closed in contentment. 2 weeks after, she led him out of his stall and into the barn aisle, and he walked beside her like they'd been doing it for years. The breakthrough had come at a terrible cost, a storm that could have killed them both, damage to the property that would take months and thousands of dollars to fully repair. But Opal couldn't bring herself to regret it. Some lessons could only be learned in the fire. Some trust could only be forged in shared danger. A month after the storm, on a bright October morning with the sky impossibly blue and the mountains dusted with the first snow of the season, Opal led Flint out to the round pen, the space where they'd first started learning to communicate, where he'd first chosen to approach her instead of running away. She'd been working with him on groundwork, teaching him to respond to pressure and release, to back up, to side pass, to stand still for examination. All the foundational skills that a horse needed to be safely handled. And today, she was going to try something new. She carried a saddle blanket with her into the round pen. Flint sniffed it curiously, no longer frightened by new objects. Opal let him investigate it thoroughly, then slowly, carefully laid it across his back. Flint's muscles tensed, and he turned his head to look at the blanket, but he didn't bolt. Opal stood beside him, one hand on his neck, waiting for him to process this new sensation. After a moment, his breathing steadied. "Good boy," Opal murmured. "Such a good, brave boy." She left the blanket there for a few minutes, then removed it and rewarded Flint with scratches on his favorite spot, just behind his left ear. They repeated the exercise 3 more times, and by the last repetition, Flint was completely relaxed. Opal knew it would be months before Flint was ready to be ridden, if he ever was. That wasn't the point. The point was that he was learning he could handle new experiences without fear shutting him down, that his world could keep expanding and he'd be okay. As she led him back to the barn, Flint walked calmly beside her, his head level with her shoulder, completely relaxed. They passed the construction crew that was working on the barn roof, and Flint barely glanced at them. The sounds of hammering and power tools, which would have sent him into a panic 6 weeks ago, now warranted only mild curiosity. Inside the barn, Opal removed Flint's halter and scratched his forehead. He leaned into the touch, his eyes closing, and made a sound that was almost like a sigh. "I miss him too," Opal said softly, thinking of Roy. "Every single day I miss him, but I think he'd be proud of us, of both of us." Flint opened his eyes and looked at her, and Opal could have sworn she saw understanding there. Maybe that was anthropomorphizing. Maybe that was just her need to believe that all this effort meant something. But in that moment, looking into the eyes of a horse who had learned to trust again, Opal felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind of hope that was just fear in disguise, but the quiet, steady kind. The kind that said tomorrow would come, and it would bring new challenges and new joys, and she would be ready for them. That she wasn't just surviving Roy's death anymore, she was building a life after it. As Opal walked back to the house that evening, the sun setting behind the mountains in shades of gold and purple, she heard Flint call to her from the barn, a long, clear whinny that carried across the distance. She turned and waved, even though she knew he couldn't possibly understand the gesture, but maybe he did, because he called again, and this time it sounded like a greeting, like hello, like I see you, like you're part of my herd now. And that, Opal thought, was everything. 6 months later, spring came to Montana with the sudden violence that mountain springs always bring. The snow melted in rushing torrents, the meadows exploded into wildflowers, and the air filled with the songs of returning birds. The barn repairs were finished, better than they'd been before. The new roof didn't leak, and the reinforced walls could withstand winds that would make the old structure shake. Opal had started taking on client horses, other rescue cases, other animals that trainers had given up on. Word had spread through the regional rescue network about the woman who gentled the impossible Mustang, and now 3 more horses were living on the Bridger property, each one learning in their own time that humans didn't have to mean pain. But Flint remained special. He was the first. The one who had taught Opal that she could do this work, that Roy's legacy lived on through her hands, and her patience and her willingness to sit in the darkness with terrified creatures until they remembered how to be brave. On a warm afternoon in May, Opal saddled Flint for the first time. Not to ride, they'd been building up to that slowly, step by step, and were still weeks away from that milestone. But to let him feel the weight of the saddle, to understand that this equipment was just another form of communication, not a threat. Flint stood perfectly still in the round pen as Opal placed the saddle on his back. His ears were forward, curious instead of frightened. When she tightened the girth, slowly, carefully, giving him time to adjust, he turned his head to watch her work, but showed no signs of distress. "Remember when you wouldn't let me within 10 feet of you?" Opal said, running her hand along his neck. "Look at you now." She led him around the round pen with the saddle on, letting him feel how it moved with his body, how it became an extension of the communication between them. They walked for 20 minutes, and Flint's stride remained relaxed and even. When they stopped, Opal carefully removed the saddle and rewarded him with the carrots she always carried in her pocket. A truck pulled up to the property as Opal was putting the saddle away. She recognized the vehicle. It belonged to Anderson, the man who ran the rescue organization that had brought Flint to her 10 months ago. He climbed out of the truck with a woman Opal didn't recognize, and they both walked over to where Opal was standing at the round pen fence. "Heard you were making progress," Anderson said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Wanted to see for myself." "This is Nora. She runs a similar operation up in Alberta." Opal shook hands with both of them, then looked back at Flint, who was rolling in the sand of the round pen, groaning with pleasure as he scratched his back. "He's come a long way," Opal said simply. Anderson laughed. "That's an understatement. The last time I saw this horse, he tried to kick through a fence to get away from me. Now look at him." Nora was watching Flint with professional interest. "How long did it take to get to this point?" "About 10 months, Opal said, "but the real breakthrough happened during a storm. Sometimes trauma needs to be met with something equally intense to break through it." "Not that I'd recommend planning for that," she added quickly. "The storm was beyond terrifying." "I heard about that," Anderson said. "Heard you stayed in the barn with him when the tornado warning went out. That was either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," Opal admitted. "But he wouldn't leave, and I wasn't going to abandon him," Nora smiled. "That's the difference, isn't it? Between breaking a horse and healing one. You stayed." They talked for another hour about training techniques and rescue cases, and the particular challenges of working with animals whose trust had been shattered by human cruelty. When Anderson and Nora finally left, they took with them a list of resources Opal had compiled. Roy's old notebooks, training videos, contact information for veterinarians and farriers who understood trauma-informed care. As their truck disappeared down the long driveway, Opal returned to the round pen where Flint was standing at the fence, watching her approach. "You've got admirers now," she told him, scratching behind his ears. "People driving hours just to see the impossible Mustang who learned to trust again." Flint leaned into her touch, his eyes soft. In the paddocks beyond the barn, the other rescue horses grazed peacefully. The chickens were clucking in their coop. The barn cats were sunning themselves on the fence rails. The whole property felt alive with the kind of peace that comes from being exactly where you're meant to be. Opal thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, broken, lost, going through the motions of living without any real sense of purpose. And she thought about Roy, whose death had felt like the end of everything, but had actually been the beginning of something new, something harder and more rewarding than she ever could have imagined. "Thank you," she said quietly, not entirely sure if she was talking to Flint or Roy or the universe itself. "Thank you for teaching me how to be brave again." Flint nickered softly, then turned and walked back to the center of the round pen, where a patch of afternoon sunlight painted the sand gold. He stood there, solid and calm, a living testament to the power of patience and the possibility of healing. And Opal, watching him, felt something she hadn't felt in years: grateful. Not just for what she'd accomplished, but for who she'd become in the process. For the woman who had learned to sit with fear and pain and uncertainty, and to trust that on the other side of all that darkness there might be light. The storm had tested them both, but it hadn't broken them. Instead, it had revealed what they were capable of when they chose trust over fear, when they chose to stay instead of run. That was worth everything. So what can we take from Opal and Flint's story? What does it teach us about trust, about healing, about the moments that define who we become? I think it's this: sometimes the hardest battles we face aren't the ones we can plan for. Sometimes the tests that matter most come at us sideways, in the form of storms we didn't predict, in moments when every instinct tells us to run, but something deeper tells us to stay. Opal could have given up on Flint dozens of times when he wouldn't approach. When he reared and kicked and showed every sign that he'd never trust again. When the storm came and she had every reason to save herself and let him face his fate alone. But she stayed. And that staying, that consistent, stubborn, loving presence was what changed everything. We all have our storms. We all have moments when we're asked to choose between running to safety or staying with something difficult. And there's no shame in survival, in protecting yourself when you need to. But Opal's story reminds us that some of the most profound transformations happen when we're willing to sit in the darkness with another being and say, "I'm not leaving. Whatever happens, I'm right here." That's true for horses. It's true for people. It's true for the versions of ourselves that are still learning to trust, still healing from old wounds, still figuring out how to be brave in a world that sometimes feels designed to break us. The storm tested Opal and Flint, but it didn't define them. What defined them was the choice they made in the middle of that storm, to trust each other, to stay together, to believe that on the other side of fear, there might be something worth reaching for. If you found value in this story, consider what storms you're facing in your own life. Consider what it might mean to stay instead of run, to choose trust even when it terrifies you, to believe that healing is possible even when it seems impossibly far away. Because if a traumatized Mustang and a grieving widow can find their way to trust in the middle of a Montana storm, then maybe, just maybe, so can you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next story.